So, what is appropriate to bring up in the pulpit, or perhaps even through social media? I want to focus on Glenn and John with that question, but certainly Caitlin and Eric, if you want to add to that. And start with Glenn here. What do you consider appropriate to bring up in the pulpit or in social media? And if you'd like to use specific examples or general areas, that's fine, whatever you like.
Well, first of all, I think pastors are under tremendous pressure from their people and from strangers on social media. So every week, several times a week, there'll be a trending topic or not even an event, but just something that will say, hey, if your pastor doesn't address this, time to find a new church and all of that. And there's a certain point where this crosses into a kind of pressure or mob sort of influence on pastors. And I'm empathetic to pastors to say, look, you can't address everything all the time, and it's difficult. But what I think the challenge is for all of us is to try to make sure that we're seeing beyond the prism of our own politics and beyond the prism of our own perspective. If our churches are homogenous, then we're always going to speak out on this issue, but maybe never on this other one. And if we find ourselves doing that, we might need to look around the room and say, goodness, maybe we need to actually listen to other voices of other perspectives, other Christians. One of my, part of the research that I did with the Resilient Pastor for this book that released a couple months ago, is we discovered that, for one example, Black Christians and white Christians have a very different perspective on whether there's a racial injustice problem in this country. And if you're in a primarily white congregation, you might never speak out on racial injustice or even on Black pain, on someone being killed by cops or whatever, or the events in Buffalo that happened, over the weekend. But that's an example to say, don't just listen to the perspectives of the people in your congregation, but the perspectives of the body of Christ. We need the help from the body of Christ to help us recognize where we've got blinders on, and we all do. So we need some of that. So again, by bracketing out the sort of social media mob, I'm not saying, okay, don't pay attention to anyone else, because the other extreme would be to just sort of have this tunnel vision of our own perspective. So what I try to think about as a pastor is I try to think about what are some kingdom priorities, and I get that by reading the Gospels. And I think for all of us as Christians, if we would read the Gospels with a certain kind of regularity, we'll recognize who Jesus prioritizes in his ministry and in his mission. And oftentimes it's the people that society does not prioritize, or the people that society does not value. So the way society was structured in the first century, talking about the ordering of power, there were certain people that were pushed on the fringes of that. But Jesus made it his priority to go to those places. The Scottish Black theologian John Swinton says, when Jesus goes to the margin becomes the middle. And I think that's what we need to think about, is how do we kingdom priorities. The second thing I think I have found to be helpful, mostly by doing this poorly, by not doing this, I should say, is to use biblical categories. And what I mean by that is sometimes we want to use words or phrases that are the language of the discourse in the world around us. But we can get into trouble because we don't always recognize how those words, like to John's point earlier, how those words or phrases or theories are being used or applied. And so when we try to comment outside of the vein of our expertise or knowledge, we get into trouble. And so you have pastors condemning, theories that they actually don't know much about. And I think it's more helpful to use biblical categories. And so, for example, if I'm preaching on justice, I don't want to use the categories of, the oppressed are automatically virtuous and the oppressor is automatically evil, because in the biblical narrative of the Exodus story of liberation, for example, you get Pharaoh is this sort of symbol of evil and the evil oppressor, but Israel, as soon as they're liberated, they start worshiping a golden calf. So the Bible makes us confront even issues of justice and oppression with more complexity than other categories might. So kingdom priorities, biblical categories, and then thirdly, pastoral sensitivities. I'm always trying to be aware of how people are affected by this. So I can give an example, two examples here. One was over the weekend after the reports of the shooting in Buffalo. I mentioned it in the sermon and talked about how this is an occasion to listen to the pain of the Black community and to recognize why these events produce so much fear and anxiety. But it's also an invitation for us to respond to the power of the Spirit and be agents of healing and reconciliation and more. A couple weeks before that, when in response to the leaked documents of Roe versus Wade and that ruling, the pastoral sensitivities come to play there, where I wanted to say to people, wherever you might feel about this specific ruling, you're welcome here in our church. And I also wanted to say, now Christians throughout the centuries have been unashamedly the advocates and champions of life from the womb to the tomb. The church at its best has done, this, and this throughout church history. So you can say
Mhm.
convictional statements, but if you miss out on pastoral sensitivities, we're missing out on the opportunity to actually shepherd and disciple people. So kingdom priorities, biblical categories, and pastoral sensitivities